Okay. Great. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, CLF Toronto, and everybody who has decided to sit and eat lunch by their screen and listen to this presentation. I really appreciate your time and your here. This is a presentation that's sort of comes out of the book that Bruce and I wrote last year, and the idea of the book and this presentation is to sort of point the way towards thinking about architecture that goes beyond kind of the do less harm paradigm and starts to really think about ways that we could do more good. The focus here is going to be on climate, but I kind of never, in my own kind of practice and thinking, I never sort of try to leave behind all the other aspects of building that's good for people in the planet behind. So, glad to, especially at the Q&A, entertain, how building health and equity and all of those kinds of things can be built into this notion of buildings that do more good instead of do less harm. So I said to Michael that I kind of prepared the carbon nerd version of this presentation. I'm mostly giving it to crowds that don't know very much about embodied carbon. So I'm going to keep this, intro to what is embodied carbon really brief, so we can kind of get into the meat of things. But I think along with most practitioners in the field who sort of have been thinking about environment and climate, our attention 25-ish years ago was really focused on the fact that operating buildings causes a lot of emissions, and we've kind of spent a few decades now really learning about that, learning how to change that trajectory, and that's starting to be pretty well baked into our codes and a sort of general approach to buildings where we've widely acknowledged that those emissions need to be tapered down quickly and get to zero as soon as possible. I'm sure everybody on this call knows that that the other piece to that is the fact that sort of making the buildings in the first place also causes a lot of emissions, and that there's a real critical importance to addressing that. Partly because of the scale, as we started to measure it over the last 10 years, we realized how many emissions and how big a contribution that is, but also the fact that those emissions are kind of committed to the atmosphere on day one of that building's operation, and so it's a sort of burst of emissions that we can't really change that trajectory once the building's been made. And again, you're probably familiar with charts like this that are kind of showing how the upfront embodied carbon compares to annual operating carbon for various scenarios where if the building's not particularly efficient, over the next 20-ish years, 30 years, it might be that those two things equal each other by then. As we start to make buildings more efficient, even if the embodied carbon doesn't change, the overall percentage that it represents of the full carbon footprint really grows. And again, if we start getting buildings down to low or zero annual operating emissions, if that upfront piece stays the same and we don't reduce it, the sort of percentage that it represents just gets bigger. And I'm sure you've also seen things like this, where if you kind of snip out just the next few years on this graph, it's funny, every year we get closer to that 2030 line, and the number of years on that bottom axis gets smaller. But the bottom line here is that as we zoom into what needs to happen in the very short term, embodied carbon, regardless of sort of the energy use of the building, just represents such a huge proportion of the emissions that we need to do something about it. So, we want to get both kinds of emissions down to zero as quickly as possible, and that is kind of the doing less harm paradigm. the last thing the planet needs right now is more emissions in the atmosphere to drive warming even further. So, any reductions, some people are being very ambitious about this. Some people are being very, like implementing things at a more slow pace, but, widely we acknowledge that we need to kind of like bend that harm curve down and be doing less harm. And what I sort of want to present here is, a way that we can think about going beyond just doing less harm, and in fact, kind of thinking about buildings as a way to potentially start healing the climate by essentially, as my co-author Bruce puts it, bringing some of that carbon back home out of the atmosphere and durably storing it in buildings, and literally using buildings as repositories or banks for that atmospheric carbon, as a place to sort of have a useful life on the planet. Obviously, there are a lot of people exploring ways to bring that carbon down and, put it in oceans, put it in rock formations, all of those sorts of things, which we probably also need to do. But the beauty of doing this with buildings is that we need buildings, and they provide real societal use, as well as being carbon repositories. So they really have a sort of double impact on healing the climate. And I'll sort of be making the point that even if that carbon storage in buildings is not indefinite, and for the most part it won't be, but even if it lasts 40, 50, 60, and ideally we start thinking about buildings as being more durable, and we'll talk about some ways to extend the life of the carbon we might put in buildings. But even if that carbon is re-emitted, decades down the road, the good that storing it now can do is real and measurable and meaningful. And regardless of end of life scenarios, there's a really important impact of drawing emissions down now rather than adding to them. And again, we'll explore that in some more detail as we go along here. And everybody on the call probably knows this comparison of a environmental product declaration to a sort of nutrition label for building materials, where the global warming potential of a given material is a factor, and we can multiply that factor by the amount of the material we're using to sort of be able to estimate the emissions that are associated with that material. This is obviously really important. This has totally started to transform the way that designers and practitioners can really start to measure what they're doing and be able to make improvements and measure those improvements. It's been really great, and obviously this kind of EPD data is going to get there will be more of it. It's going to get better. It's going to get more accurate. It's going to get more comparable. But even where we are right now, it really provides some important insights and understandings as to what our impacts are going to be. But I think if we want to be thinking about the do more good and not do less harm, or combining those two things, we really need to also, as part of these EPDs, be able to clearly see if carbon is being stored in those materials and how much. And currently the sort of rules around declaring that are not particularly helpful. There are several allowable pathways for doing that, which include kind of ignoring any stored carbon altogether. It includes just sort of saying, well, there's some carbon stored at the beginning, but it all comes out at the end, so let's just call it zero. There's showing it in the production, the A phase part of an EPD, and then showing the actual anticipated emissions at the end of life. But often in the A phase, you're kind of just given a net number, so the emissions and the carbon storage don't show up distinctly, which makes it hard to know how much is stored and how much is emitted. And so, as part of the sort of push for more clarity and more transparency in EPDs, I think really making sure that this amount of carbon stored shows up as its own figure that we can think about and contemplate and calculate with, distinct from the emissions rather than blending them into a single number. There are sort of two ways that we can store carbon in buildings, and definitely right now the leading contenders are all biological. So we're looking at basically plant materials, and the way that they store carbon is they draw it out of the atmosphere when the plants are growing. I still find that there's some misunderstandings when you talk about sort of carbon storing building materials, that a lot of people kind of have this notion that we're talking about materials that are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere while the building is there. But for all the biomass type materials, that work is actually done by the plant when the plant is growing, and it's just a static amount of carbon that's stored in those materials when it's in the building. And so via the beauty of photosynthesis, all plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They are releasing the oxygen from that compound back to us as a wonderful co-product, as people like to call these things, so that we can breathe. And the carbon atoms themselves are sort of incorporated into the structure of the body of the plant. And depending on the plant, the amount of carbon stored kind of ranges from 35 to 55%. And again, this is something that's important if we want to start calculating this, is knowing what plants store how much carbon. Fortunately, there are a few great resources. The one that I really like to use is this Phyllis database, which has multiple samples of literally every kind of biomass that you can imagine, and it's sort of been analyzed for the amount of carbon content. So you can see here we're looking at flax straw, and it's sort of 46 to 48% carbon content. You can look at all the samples and kind of take averages and have a pretty good sense of which plants are storing how much carbon. So that part of the equation is relatively straightforward to be able to understand. If we want to think about a strategy for how we want to kind of move through the do less harm and into the do more good, the first step is obviously create the most impact with fewer materials. So simply being conscious of the amount of material we're using, not overusing materials, that's like that sort of early and no-brainer strategy. The second part is to reduce the amount of material with the high embodied carbon, both by reducing the amounts of that material and seeking out versions of those materials that have lower emissions. So the variation between different manufacturers of and suppliers of things like concretes and metals and plastics and glass. You can sort of see, especially through resources like the EC3 database, how to kind of procure the things that have those reductions. And that's still really important, like sort of running parallel to everything I'm going to say about carbon storing materials. If you want to get a building to a place where it's net storing more carbon than was emitted, obviously, if you can bring the amount of emissions down, you don't need as much storage to offset them. Or correspondingly, like the more you draw that down, the more net storage there will be. So it's not like the idea is, oh, just don't worry about all the stuff that emits, just like store like crazy. No, these two things kind of happen simultaneously, and so that reduction pathway that I'm sure everybody at CLF Toronto is on is not it's a critical part of the strategy. But then the piece that we're sort of adding here today is to increase the amount of materials you have in the building that have these sort of quote unquote negative emissions, or emissions storage that shows up as a negative number if you're looking at EPDs or LCA results. And so those include ag residues, waste and recycling fibers, crops that are grown specifically to be buildings and timber as well. And the premise of how this works on the biogenic carbon side is it's basically there's already a carbon cycle happening on the planet. That's what the planet has been doing for hundreds of millions of years. Plants are drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. They grow, whether they grow for a month or they grow for 1,000 years. At some point that plant dies. It might be eaten, it might burn, it might rot, but in some way the CO2 that was absorbed in that growing goes back to the atmosphere, and we've had this really great carbon cycle on the planet that has kept the atmosphere in balance pretty well. And now that we're sort of the humans are part of that cycle. Sometimes we're intentionally growing these plants. Sometimes they're just growing all by themselves as they did naturally. But also, what happens to these plants also has a lot to do with our own kind of use of them and our own sort of treatment of wastes from that. But as we sort of use and discard plant-based materials, our typical approaches to dealing with the waste is to either bury it or burn it. And in both of those scenarios, it's still part of this carbon cycle, because whether you burn it or bury it, all or most of that carbon does end up back in the atmosphere. So with biogenic carbon in buildings, what we're really doing is sort of interrupting that carbon cycle and putting this delay in the middle where the carbon that was drawn out of the atmosphere doesn't go right back to the atmosphere. It goes into a building. And this is not a strategy that will alter the climate, for thousands of years to come. This is really, its real use is to us right now when we have way too much carbon in the atmosphere and we only have a certain number of decades to stop doing that, and in fact to try to reduce the burden of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's where transforming these things into buildings really helps, because they can hold on to that carbon while we're still over emitting and while we're starting to figure out this plus other drawdown scenarios. And so that kind of like 50, 60 to ideally 200-year lifespan of buildings is exactly the time frame that we need to be getting carbon out of the atmosphere and banking it somewhere. And we'll talk at the towards the end about end of life, but regardless of end of life right now, there's a huge value to this. And you'll see, if you're reading IPCC reports, you'll see that CDR and various kinds of carbon drawdown and carbon capture scenarios are being more and more. We're realizing we've got to bake a whole lot of this in to our climate plans, or we're not going to kind of stop or sort of rein in emissions quickly enough. And so these kinds of scenarios become really critical to our path at staying within a reasonable temperature range. So one of the things that I think is really important if we're going to take biomass in buildings seriously is to not consider all biomass the same. I think if we think about the different types of biomass that we can put in buildings, there's some very important distinctions in them in terms of how we would think about them in life cycle assessment, and what factors sort of are and aren't considered in LCA right now that actually are quite different for different types of biomass. And so I've sort of categorized them here. The categories are rough and approximate, but they do kind of characterize a lot of the material types that we see in the market now, and things that people are sort of currently developing and hopefully will be available soon. And so, in sort of, I think anyway, order of value in terms of the impact that storing that carbon will have, dealing with waste stream fibers. So, we already know how to allocate emissions and potentially storage in life cycle assessment for recycled materials. So, from the waste stream, we have all kinds of things: paper fibers, cardboard fibers, textile fibers. There's a huge amount of this stuff that currently is going to landfill or being incinerated, and so preventing those emissions and instead storing that carbon is a pretty direct and easy to attribute way of storing carbon in buildings. Agricultural residues are pretty close to that, in that what we're talking about here are plants that we're already growing for food, but there are sort of quite often sizable amounts of biomass that are sort of created in order to create that food product. And again, that biomass is largely either being burned off or rotted off and ends up back in the atmosphere again. And the reason agricultural residues, I think, shows up high on this list is that when we're creating those products, we're also growing food at the same time. And so the impacts that you measure in an LCA, so that the fertilizer inputs and the fuel for the tractors and all of those things that would go in, the impact of those is kind of split between the primary product, the food, and the leftover product, the straw. So in fact, if you're able to use those agricultural residues, you're getting kind of like a half, or the impacts can be split. They're typically split by monetary value. So the wheat is more valuable than the straw. So you might say the wheat has 80% of the emissions associated with creating it, and the straw has 20, or something like that. But however you do it, the great part about using agricultural residues is it's not forcing land use change. We're already growing all this food. We need to be growing that food, and if we can use the biomass that's left over from that food, we're not diverting land for away from food production. We're not necessarily changing forests to agricultural lands. So anyway, that's sort of another category. A smaller category of materials right now, but one that I think has a huge amount of promise, are lab-grown materials. I'll show you some soon, but these would be things like mycelium and algae and microbial materials. And those are pretty easy to deal with in LCA because it's just manufacturing. There's a factory, you have inputs, and you have outputs, and it's all pretty easy to measure. And so if those materials also happen to be in that manufacturing process, drawing carbon out of the atmosphere or using carbon storing materials from another waste stream, that's also easy to attribute in LCA. Purpose-grown crops gets a little bit trickier because you are potentially taking land away from other uses. You may be displacing food crops. Not that there's not a place for purpose-grown crops, but in terms of figuring out the details of how we think about these in LCA, there's more to think about there. In particular, because of some of the purpose-grown crops that already have a lot of use in buildings, like things like bamboo and cork, are sort of slightly longer cycle plants too. So thinking about that in terms of how much there is for how long it takes for those materials to regenerate also becomes part of the LCA thinking. And then finally, I know it's kind of the poster child for carbon storing materials, but Bruce and I in the book, and I think lots of people who are thinking about biomass in a more broad lens than just wood and mass timber, figuring out whether this is actually meaningful carbon storage is really tricky. It's really complicated, and I'm not sure that it necessarily will prove to be. I know that it won't prove to be a solution that works globally at really large scale. And where we think it might work, like places in North America where there is a lot of timber production already, there's a lot to do to figure out in the end, did it help the climate to put this wood in the building or not? And I think we're not in a place to be able to answer that. And unfortunately, what I see happening is the questions that arise in trying to think about, how does carbon stored in wood and mass timber count? Because that's complicated, we tend to write off all biomass materials when in fact the rest of the biomass materials are a lot easier to think about and to see how that carbon storage that they offer is really valuable to the climate. So just some examples, because these things aren't imaginary. In some cases, we've been using lots of these biomass materials for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Currently in our sort of more modern context, there are lots of them that are either out there or coming soon. So from the waste stream, things like cellulose made from waste newsprint and cardboard, it's had 70 or 80 years on the market. Really well adopted in some locations and for some types of buildings. Textiles is a growing both problem by how much fast fashion is created and what happens to it at the end of its life. But there are also lots of people doing great work, figuring out how to put all of that textile waste into buildings. Companies making sheeting boards and wall finishing boards out of drinking boxes. Even urban biomass. There are some companies now making great insulation products literally out of grass clippings from airports and highway medians and things like that. So, we can literally identify billions of tons of these waste stream fibers that get thrown out every year. And so finding uses for them in buildings and working to adopt them is a really quick and simple and very easy to do the climate math on the positive impact of not sending all of this carbon back to the atmosphere, but putting it in buildings. Ag residues, like I sort of hinted at a few slides earlier, I think this is probably the most exciting place for development, simply because we're already producing this material. Globally, there's just vast amounts of ag residues involved with basically every kind of farming, and so the solutions that you might have for putting ag residues in buildings are going to vary regionally. But there's never any shortage of potential regionally. So, just some things here, a few examples of using grain straw, whether it's chopped up as blown-in insulation, compressed into boards, made into blocks. Hemp also has a lot of potential, both as sort of hempcrete blocks and panels and sheathing, but also as bat insulation and things like that. So, the list is it can be overwhelming even to think about it all. There's great examples of people using palm kernel shells as replacement for stone aggregate in concrete in places where they grow a lot of palm kernel. It just goes on and on. Coconut fibers and sugar bagasse, and a quick look through a UN report on what's grown where in the world and how much residue is created in doing that. It's like a shopping list for anybody wanting to sort of innovate in this space, because there are literally billions and billions of tons of these materials out there, and most of them do have some use that we could put them to in buildings. And I do often get asked, like, yeah, but is there enough of this stuff to be thinking about it at this scale and actually having a climate impact? And the answer to that, I think, is a resounding yes. So even just looking at grain straw, which is only one kind of agriculture, currently right now we produce about 2.2 billion tons of grain straw a year. So that's the 2.2 billion tons. That's the stock that's left over after we take the grain away and process it and eat it. So that means that every single year on this planet, the grain straw crops alone draw all of India's emissions out of the atmosphere. So that's the third biggest emitting country on the planet, and our farmers globally are already planting the plants that pull that that scale of emissions out of the atmosphere. And we simply let that go back on an annual basis as well. So even if we only used half of that annual grain straw harvest in buildings, which leaves plenty for all the other uses that straw has. In fact, it sort of depends where you are in the world, but between 10 to 20% of straw is usually wanting to be sort of retained on the farm or already has an end use. But even if we only took half of that straw, that's a 2 billion ton per year drawdown available. And putting that stuff in our buildings is a pretty great place to be able to store that. So when people talk about gigatons of storage, there's a couple gigatons of the approximately 10 the IPCC says we need annually starting really soon. There's a fifth of it by putting half of our annual grain straw harvests into buildings. The lab grown materials I'm super excited about. I think to me, this is where a lot of the real transformation is going to happen in the building space, in particular with mycelium composites, most of which have been sort of thought of as insulation now, but there are some companies developing flooring, interior wall partitions, and even structural mycelium. So these are things, the structural mycelium, it grows in 4 days. So imagine being able to grow the equivalent of a 2x4 in 4 days and leave the forests alone, rather than having to have a tree grow for 30, 40 years, go down into the forest, cut it down, leave half of the tree unused in order to get that 2x4. Being able to grow materials like that is really exciting, as are the developments that are happening in algae grown cement and microbe cement. Here we're starting to veer into not so much biomass, but carbonation, where the CO2 is stored more durably than it is in plant-based materials. Purpose-grown crops, we've been using these for buildings for a long time, things like cork bark, bamboo, hemp, and increasingly now seaweed, all kinds of great products and materials made from these things, and lots of room for development of more of those. In fact, for people who are excited about mass timber, there's a whole lot of the world that would benefit more from mass bamboo than from mass timber, and some really great work going on in developing both sort of like CLT type panels with bamboo, and also LVLs and all the other mass timber products, but with bamboo fibers as the base rather than timber fibers. And then finally we get to timber, and I think that sometimes people think that I'm like opposed to timber or that I'm anti-wood. I'm definitely not. I think I've been a builder for most of my career, and there is so much that's wonderful about working with and using timber. But in terms of its its use as carbon storage and as a sort of climate tool, I think there's so much that we currently aren't considering in LCA looks at timber. And I think we really need to, there's a bunch of details on the slide about some of the open questions and some of the things that we don't consider now that would certainly change how you look at carbon stored in a building from timber. But really, I think we just need a whole lot more work and calculation and sort of certainty before we start chopping down even more forests to ostensibly help save the climate. So that's not to say that I don't think timber can be carbon storing. I think there are certainly forestry practices and places in the world where you could feasibly do that. My feeling right now is we just don't know if that's happening, how that should happen, and how to tell the difference between timber that's helping and timber that's harming. And then finally, I think to really understand how we use this notion of carbon storage, we have to start thinking about dynamic LCA rather than static LCA. And I just, this week actually was directed to this tool, and you can find it here. It's part of a paper that was done at Bath University in the UK. So it's a free tool. I would suggest, you might want to rush over there after this presentation and download it and start playing with it yourself. But right now, when we think about or when we do a life cycle assessment of a building, we kind of get these numbers from all the different A and B and C phases of the life cycle, but we tend to treat those as equivalent numbers. So for example, a material that emits 2,500 tons of emissions when it's first made, and then it has 2,500 tons associated with its end of life phase. A typical LCA just sort of adds those up and says the impact of that material is 5,000 tons. 2,500 here, 2,500 here equals 5. And so that's actually the same as a material that has 5,000 tons up front and 0 at the end of life. But that's not how the climate feels that. So, when emissions, or in this case, storage happen, is also really important. The climate feels those impacts dynamically. And those of us in embodied carbon have always sort of been champions of that idea that the upfront carbon matters because it goes into the atmosphere now, and it's resident in the atmosphere for a long time and sort of drives warming at a accelerating rate because you put this big poof of emissions into the atmosphere up front. So, when we look at life cycle assessment results, it's really important to sort of understand how they work in time. And so, this is me just starting to play around with that. But one of the great outputs from this tool is it literally gives you temperature change effect from the emissions that you're noting in an LCA, and you can it operates on a sort of it gives you inputs for every year, so you can show your upfront, you can show when materials get replaced, you can add operational emissions to this, and it sort of at the time of the release of all of those emissions starts to actually track the temperature change effect. So this is the curve for 5 tons of emissions today. So if you put a material in your building that emits 5 tons, this is sort of literally the amount that it adds to temperature change. It's putting the temperature up. These numbers are very tiny in degrees Kelvin because 5 tons is a very small amount of carbon, but that's the profile of how that drives warming over the next 100 years. Over here is what 5 tons stored today looks like. And if 4 of those tons are emitted in 50 years, the end of life scenario, that material never contributes to warming, even when 80% of it is released to the atmosphere. So I chose that because if you bury it in a landfill, there's a percentage that is assumed to sort of stay unemitted. We could be thinking about turning it into biochar. There's all kinds of ways that we don't have to emit the full 5 tons. But what's interesting is that you can emit 80% of that in 50 years, and it will never have contributed to warming. But in the meantime, for the 50 years that it was in the building, it's had this impact on cooling, which you'll notice is basically the same as at the height as the impact of the warming of the same 5 tons. So I think we really do want to start looking at our results in a dynamic way and understand that what happens up front and what happens when materials are repaired and replaced and eventually disposed of those numbers aren't the real impacts on the climate. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to sort of bring this more into the way that all of us in the building world sort of think about emissions. And I'm going to wrap up here with just a look at the fact that some of this is going on at a scale that I think a lot of people in architecture don't quite realize, mostly because it's not happening here in North America. But here's a very large public school project in France made with prefabricated straw bale panels as the exterior wall system, and that's all kind of like wrapping a timber frame. So lots of these buildings I haven't been able to find actual LCA reports on them, but from what I know about the carbon storage values for things like straw, this is going to be storing a significant amount of carbon in that building. I don't know if it makes it a net carbon storing building, but there are dozens of tons of CO2 being sequestered in that building. It's a large mall in the UK, a Marks and Spencer store. Again, it's based on a timber frame, but in this case, the exterior walls are hempcrete panels that sort of wrap the building. It's a 7-story apartment building in France. Again, similar kind of notion, a timber frame wrapped in a different version of a straw bale wall panel. The Enterprise Center in the UK has, like, they basically made an effort to put bio-based materials everywhere they could. So including this really interesting thatched cladding on the exterior, but also all kinds of things on the interior of the building, as well as a timber frame. So things like cork flooring, woven straw ceiling panels, all kinds of stuff inside that building. It's a great example. And knowing that new building isn't what we necessarily need to be focused on. In fact, we need to be retrofitting all kinds of buildings at a really large scale. Here's an example of a straw and wood fiber board panel being used to retrofit a large sports hall in the Netherlands. So, again, employing these fairly straightforward and simple and quite low tech approaches to, not only making this building have less impact in terms of its operating emissions, but, storing, dozens of tons of carbon while achieving that. That's a repeat. This is an example of a smaller project, and I'm showing it to you because this is a project that I was involved with here in Peterborough, Ontario at Trent University. And it's a much smaller building, but in this case, we actually do have all the numbers for what went into the building, and so it can sort of share you like an actual result. So we were able to work with Trent when we came on. This building was already sort of in the planning works, and so we knew what kind of building it was going to be initially, and so we were able to make a model of that building, which was going to have just under 500 kilograms of CO2e per square meter of carbon intensity in the materials, or the net total for the building of just over 200 tons. And then we sort of got it in its as-built form down to 25 tons, or only 60 kilograms per square meter, which is an 88% reduction. This third column here is showing if we had counted the timber in the building as carbon storage as well. And there was part of us that was sort of interested to explore that, because we worked really hard to make sure that the timber for that building was sourced as sustainably as possible. I'm not sure that FSC sourcing and carbon storage, we sometimes tend to think of them as being synonymous, but I'm not sure that they are. But if we did capture or count the carbon stored in the wood, this building would actually be just slightly in the net carbon storing side of things. And when you look at the building, it's got metal siding, it's got a concrete foundation. It's not that it's all carbon storing materials, but there are enough carbon storing materials to in the middle scenario here come close to offsetting all of the emitted carbon, or in the one on the right fully doing that. And so I'll just sort of finish up by saying, there's a lot of people who sort of describe what we need to do for the climate as a bit of a moonshot, but I actually feel like in the buildings world, it's not as complicated as that. There is globally all kinds of examples and already established, manufacturing machinery and all the technical know-how to be able to do this at a really large scale. And it's really just sort of waiting for us, I think, to take this notion seriously and to really start to go into building projects with the idea that I am building a carbon bank, and how do I do that in the best and most sort of cost effective and meaningful way. We probably can't get every building to be net carbon storing right now, but if that's sort of one of the goals at the beginning of a building project, is how much carbon can we store in here, I think will spur this whole industry to grow and expand really quickly, and have I think a really sizable impact on the climate. And I'm going to end here on this slide. This is some colleagues of mine at New Frameworks in Vermont, and they're making these really great prefabricated straw bale assemblies, and that that sort of from one lens, they're doing a great thing because they're storing a whole bunch of carbon in these building panels, and by all accounts, that's what we need to be doing, and they're doing a great job of it. But I think to think about these things or as opportunities to do even more good, one of the things they've done is partner with an organic farming co-op in Vermont, so that all the straw that they're getting is coming from organic farms, and those farms are also growing in such a way that they're not depleting the carbon in the soil, but the growth of the plants that are going into this building are also putting carbon into the soil, and sort of having an additional drawdown impact that way. And then socially, they have invited into their co-op some of the migrant farm workers who work at the farm, and have given them a sort of co-op ownership stake in the company, and being able to help build the panels. I mean, it's not only additional employment, but they're actually co-owners of the company, and benefit from that company as it grows and expands. And so I think if we're going to start imagining like how can we store carbon in buildings, I think we can start to imagine it the way the folks at New Frameworks have done, and say not only how can we store carbon in buildings, but how can we do it in a way that has spill-on benefits in all kinds of other important ways. And so that's kind of the hopeful outlook that I'd like to end on. And just a quick note here that if you're interested in the book that Bruce and I wrote, it kind of goes into much more detail in all of these areas. It's called Build Beyond Zero, and there's a little discount code here if you want to order it and save a bit of money. And so I will come off of screen share, and it looks like we still have some time for some Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. That was amazing. Really good to get that perspective on other biomass materials beyond mass timber. And those tools you shared are awesome too. So if anyone missed it, the links to those tools are now in the chat if you'd like to click through there. So yeah, we do have a couple minutes for Q&A, so I can read out some questions that have come up in the chat. If you asked a question and it comes up and you'd like to follow up, please feel free to turn on your camera and microphone and kind of ask Chris directly. So I'll start kind of in order of the questions that have come in. And you did touch on this a couple of times, Chris, in your presentation, but we did have a question about your opinion on including sequestered carbon from timber in embodied carbon calculations. So you did touch on it, but if you have any kind of key takeaways on that particular subject.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway, or what I'm doing in my own practice, is not counting it now. So I'm kind of using EPD emissions factors for that wood, but not putting any carbon storage value to it. And I know there's lots of different takes on that, but I feel like in the absence of any scientific certainty that this is actually helping with the climate, it doesn't seem right to start making claims that it is until we're more sure.
Great, thanks, Chris. So we have some specific questions on different biomaterials. So one question from Eric is around earthen plasters in stick frame homes. So Eric's wondering if you have any projects out there that have used this specific type of material.
Sure. In fact, I'm looking at a wall on the other side of my monitor that is exactly that. So yeah, earthen materials, I didn't really talk much about them in general, like the earthen materials, plasters, earthen floors, rammed earth, earth blocks, adobe, all that kind of stuff tends to just be low, very low carbon materials, but not actually carbon storing. However, a lot of those earthen materials incorporate natural fibers into them as part of the sort of strength matrix. And so, a clay plaster with, say, a lot of straw fiber or hemp fiber or flax fiber, or any kind of fiber in there, adobe blocks with a lot of straw, those tend to end up sort of being on the sort of net carbon storing scale, because the earth has such a low embodied carbon that the amount of biomass you're putting in sort of makes that a net carbon storage thing. So and there are some really interesting products. Again, I feel like we often have to turn to Europe to see what's coming down the pipe, but there are some really great clay board manufacturers there who are using unfired clay in place of drywall, and those do tend to have matrices of some sort of natural fiber in them, and would be kind of net carbon storing. So I think there's both the kind of homemade version of those clay plasters, but also some really great pathways to kind of industrialize them more too.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
All right. Another question from German, and I know your video is on, so maybe you want to ask it directly around cement.
I just want to put some human face here. Hey, Chris. I was asking if you know about the calcium clay cement, and we have that available in Canada.
I'm not aware of anybody who's producing it in Canada. And in fact, I'm not sure I know of anybody who's producing it in the US either. That doesn't mean it's not, but I'm not aware. And I think, that's one of those strategies that, by most accounts I've seen, that sort of LC3 cement is, kind of providing like a 40-ish% reduction in the concrete that's made with it. And so, that's really meaningful if you can knock 40% off your concrete and you're using some bio-based materials. Like, that's how we're going to get to net carbon storing quickly. So I think, LC3 cement is one of the most promising pieces of that. Like, how do we lower the embodied carbon of the high impact materials, at a good rate and practically and feasibly? That certainly seems like one of those that could do that, because it uses the same cement making machinery and processes, and it uses really widely available raw materials. So like it feels like it's the kind of thing that the cement industry is capable of moving into fairly quickly if it wanted to.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. All right. I think we probably have time for maybe one more question, Chris. So maybe I'll use this one that came in. What are the main obstacles you see as barriers to wider adoption of carbon storing materials?
I would say, there's a couple. One is the only one that seems to be on the map is mass timber. Like if you ever see carbon storage in buildings discussed, it's like 99% of the time we're talking about mass timber. So I think it's just that we don't sort of realize how much of it is out there and how many opportunities there are. I realized I forgot a slide, but I did an analysis of interiors for an architecture firm that was redeveloping one floor of a building. And, it was really easy with available and affordable materials today to make that interior net carbon storing. Like, I think with buildings, we always think about, structure and enclosure and all these things, but, so just identifying the huge range of those materials that are already out there and are available, exploring the ones that are sort of forthcoming. And I think, they are all already being manufactured. So really what we need is for those small scale manufacturers to get the help they need, whether it's, people ordering their material, government grants, help making EPDs. Like there's a whole sort of network of support that, you know, would really help the people who are already producing these things to, you know, scale that up and make them more sort of affordable and widely available.
Great, thank you. So we're just at about time. I know there's a lot of really good questions in the chat, so maybe I'll offer if anyone would like to email CLF Toronto, our email is info@clftoronto.com with your questions, and we can direct those to Chris and get you a response. But yeah, thanks again, Chris. This was awesome. The recording will be available online. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining today.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for everybody spending some time.
All right, have a great day, everyone.